Hi there, John Wilkinson again, History Made Easier again. And this video is going to take a look at Mao in the years following the White Terror. And I'm going to look at the base that Mao built at Jinggangshan, and when ousted from that first base, the Soviet that he developed at Jiangxi. These are incredibly important stepping stones on both Mao's path to power and on the kind of China that he was going to develop. So, Mao at Jinggangshan and Mao at Jiangxi. In the wake of the failed autumn harvest uprising of 1927, Mao had regrouped at Jinggangshan in the mountains of the Hunan-Jiangxi border. Leading an army was a new role for Mao, but critically it was one in which he shone and was to lead to the birth of the Red Army. He led by example and used folk tales and other imagery to inspire his men, many of whom were illiterate. He focused on building morale and commitment, specifically revolutionary spirit. To this end, he made the army an all-volunteer force, not only allowing those who wished to leave the right to do so, but giving them money for their journey. Those who stayed were promised that their rights would be protected and their voice would be heard through soldiers' committees. For their part, the soldiers were expected to treat the peasantry with respect. Whenever victory was gained, land was to be redistributed amongst the peasantry, and any profits found in possession of former landlords was to be used to fund the army's needs. Every opportunity was to be used to win over the peasantry, the workers, and also the petty bourgeoisie. Regardless of the debates that raged within the party, Mao continued to fashion the army as a revolutionary force. In what became known as the 6 main points for attention, he expanded on his original orders with respect to the peasantry. This is what his 6 points stated. After staying in peasants' homes overnight, soldiers should replace their bedding. They should return anything that had been borrowed and pay for anything damaged. They should be courteous. They should be fair in business dealings. They should also treat prisoners humanely. And 2 further points were later added. Soldiers should not molest women. Latrines should be dug well away from peasant homes and covered when leaving. And at the same time, 3 main rules of discipline were issued. Don't take anything that belongs to the masses. Turn in all goods confiscated from landlords for redistribution, and obey all orders. In this way, the Red Army would win the support of the peasantry, their hearts and minds, as it would later be portrayed. The Red Army was to be the communists' greatest propaganda tool. Mao also developed the army's tactics. In the Hunan mountains, he had heard talk amongst the peasants of a legendary bandit leader with the wonderful name Old Deaf Jew, who claimed that the key to fighting the enemy was circling around, avoiding their main forces, leading them in circles, and when they were confused and disorientated, striking at their weakest point. It is old deaf Jew and his fighting strategy that Mao adapted and became the core of the Red Army's future strategy. When the enemy advances, we withdraw. When the enemy rests, we harass. When the enemy tires, we attack. When the enemy withdraws, we pursue. And to this, he would later add 2 further instructions. Hold the army together in one major force rather than splintering into divisions that can be picked off one at a time. And in expanding an area under communist control, do so in a series of waves, so avoiding any rash advance. It would prove difficult to impose such standards on all the forces in the mountain base, though Mao tried. But in the winter of 1928, with nationalist forces moving to surround their mountain base, Mao and his men were forced to leave and succeeded in reaching the Jiangxi-Guangdong border, where they set about establishing a new base, the Jiangxi Soviet. So Mao and his fellow communists regrouped in southern Jiangxi. The Chinese Soviet Republic was formally proclaimed in November 1931 and was to survive for 3 years. The communists established a functioning government that administered a territory of about 40,000 square kilometres and 3 million people. 6 million if the smaller rural Soviets are included. And its army grew to number 300,000. Mao was made chairman of the Republic and chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, in effect, head of state and head of government. Mao acknowledged the need for flexible guerrilla tactics at Jinggangshan. Circumstances dictated its use, but he was adamant that establishing a strong base from which the revolution could be consolidated in as wide an area as possible had to be the priority. It is what he set out to do at Jinggangshan, and he started all over again at Jiangxi. Mao also saw success as being more likely to be achieved in the countryside. Mao was already convinced that he was involved in a nationalist enterprise first, though one with a clear socialist bent. The nationalism, just as much as the socialism, was specific to China. China's history, China's traditions, China's circumstance, even China's geography. But in the winter of 1930, Chiang Kai-shek set out to destroy Mao's second base. But Mao's army that had left Jinggangshan, numbering little more than 4,000, with 20% of them lost in the desperate flight. A very poorly equipped army, only half of whom had guns, was now a very different force. They were motivated, disciplined, and well trained. They were experienced too. Reconnaissance, map making, and intelligence, transportation of supplies, field kitchens, and first aid stations were all an integral part of the force. Marching plans, arrangements for river crossings, battle plans were all in place, and field telephones to aid communication. They were equipped with modern rifles too. It may still have been mostly made up of illiterate peasants, but it was a professional army for all that. It would, however, be outgunned. It had captured some machine guns and mortars, but it had insufficient ordnance and no artillery. To combat Chiang's superior forces, Mao adopted his guerrilla tactic with a tactic called luring the enemy in deep. The plan was to lure the enemy deep into the communist base area, and when they were exhausted, annihilate them. It worked to some extent. The nationalists were pushed back, but they weren't defeated. But it came at a price, as those villages that were left defenceless as the nationalists advanced suffered horrendously. Possessions were taken or else destroyed, houses burnt to the ground, women raped, and children and old people butchered. A second nationalist campaign in 1931 met with the same fate. However, Chiang returned just 2 months later, taking personal command of a force 300,000 strong. The speed with which this third campaign was organised took Mao by surprise. The communists improvised in a desperate campaign that only just saw them able to slip away into the mountains and avoid their own annihilation. They were left in control of an area with a population of 2 million, and things were about to radically change even more as Japan invaded Manchuria in September 1931. For Mao, though, he was still mistrusted by the party leadership. Even though his strategy had been vindicated and it was actively supported by the Comintern, the importance of the Red Army, the preference for guerrilla warfare, and the primacy of the struggle in the countryside were all now accepted by the Comintern, but not the party leadership. And as for the party leadership, which had remained in Shanghai, remaining there now became impossibly difficult, and the leadership decided to disperse, with Jiangxi earmarked to become the leadership's new base. So it was to Jiangxi that Zhou Enlai moved in the summer of 1931 as a first step before all the leadership moved there. This would make it likely that the clashes over strategies and tactics would only intensify, and Mao would not have the freedom of manoeuvre that distance and poor communications with Shanghai had given him. Though Mao wasn't named, a list of criticisms were clearly aimed at him. He had ignored repeated instructions to set up a Soviet government as planned by the leadership. He had failed to expand the base area. He had allowed the Red Army to adopt a guerrilla mentality. He was lacking a clear class perspective. He had been too soft on wealthy peasants, and he had paid scant attention to developing the labour movement. It paid little attention to what had been achieved in Jiangxi, achievements that had been praised by the Comintern, and the criticism arrived as they were fighting off the third of Chiang's campaigns. But of course, this was about power and nothing else, and Mao was manoeuvred out of influential positions. Two immediate issues separated Mao from the party leadership. The first, whether the Japanese invasion was a threat or an opportunity. Mao saw it as an opportunity to lead an anti-Japanese front, uniting all classes in a patriotic fight against the invader. The leadership saw it as the Soviet Union saw it, as a first step to a Japanese invasion of the Soviet Union, and so a threat to the Chinese Revolution. The second issue was the leadership's insistence on targeting cities in order to consolidate their hold on the base area. They reasonably argued that it would enable them to link up the separate areas that they controlled. But it was still a high-risk strategy. Huge distances would be involved. Nanchang was their first choice, and Gansu their alternative choice. It made sense in theory, but Mao argued that the reality was that both cities were too well defended, whilst the Red Army lacked artillery and other necessary siege equipment. His argument was accepted with respect to Nanchang, but rejected with respect to Gansu. The attack on Gansu, which Mao took no part in, went ahead but failed. In the aftermath, Mao ignored the leadership's preferred course of action and literally headed in the opposite direction, meeting, it has to be said, with success. He was fighting in the countryside. In response to criticism, Mao rounded on the party's leaders. Mao was taking on the party leadership head-on, and he couldn't win. In October 1932, Mao was ousted from positions of power, and for the next 2 years would be politically isolated as he had never been before. And though he regained some power with regard to domestic matters within the base area, i.e. the running of the Chinese Soviet Republic, he was excluded from military decision-making of any significance. What is more, with police surveillance making life ever more difficult in Shanghai, coupled with the growing importance of the Jiangxi Soviet, the party leadership finally moved en masse to the Jiangxi Soviet and lost no time in asserting itself. Now, in April 1933, it was the Maoists' turn to be purged, including Deng Xiaoping, who will feature a lot in the story ahead. They were derided as country bumpkins who failed to understand that there was no Marxism in the mountains' valleys. They didn't go without a fight, though, labelling the leadership gentlemen from a foreign house, meaning Moscow. But with their fate tied to Mao's, they too were cast aside. After Mao was ousted from power, real power was in the hands of a troika, or three-man group, consisting of Bo Gu, acting party leader, Zhou Enlai, political commissar of the Red Army, and Otto Braun, the German military advisor sent by the Comintern. Though all three were very much under the influence of the Comintern. Chiang Kai-shek, meanwhile, remained determined to crush the Jiangxi Soviet. His fourth campaign met the same fate as the previous three campaigns. Interestingly, because the communists had applied tactics very much like those adopted by Mao. But very soon a fifth campaign began with 500,000 fresh troops, including many of his best divisions, plus 300,000 auxiliaries. And most significantly, Chiang now had German military advisors, and it was they who suggested a change in tactics. Mao advised that the only option was for the Red Army to try and break out, hopefully in terrain that would better suit their mobile style of warfare. But this was rejected by Bogu and Braun, and instead the nationalist troops were attacked in pitched battles, and in a final last stand the communists were defeated. In October 1934, after months of agonized debates amongst the party leadership, and with Zhou Enlai and some of the wider leadership already mending fences with Mao, it was decided to abandon the Soviet and head to northwest Hunan, the neighbouring province. Though modest when compared with the trek they eventually undertook, it was nevertheless a desperate plan. But it seemed to offer their only hope of surviving to fight another day. Though ultimately squeezed out by Chiang Kai-shek, the Jiangxi Soviet provided the communists with vital experience of governing and was to have a powerful influence on future communist strategy. The most important thing that was learned was an insight into the peasant mentality. The peasant would only support change if it was to be guaranteed by the Red Army. They would not risk change without guarantees for fear of retribution from the forces of counter-revolution. A radical levelling of society was not popular. Tired of existing no higher than a subsistence level, the peasantry wanted land and reward for their individual efforts. And if land reform was to work, it required the participation of peasants within each village. Mao's tactic of flexible guerrilla warfare and his rural-based revolution, helped by his radical program of land redistribution, all had their origins in Jiangxi. So I hope you found that interesting and useful. I think it helps explain the Mao that we see on the Long March, the Mao that we see at Yan'an, fighting the Japanese and striking out to win the Civil War. As always, I thank you for listening, and as always, I ask you to check out my History Made Easier website. But for now, cheers.